I have a feeling we're gonna get a David and Goliath situation with Usopp and another giant in Elbaf, perhaps low-key. We know giants settle disputes through battle, and Usopp standing up to a giant would be a great way to move him one step closer to his dream. I agree wholeheartedly, and this is exactly the sort of thing I'm hoping for. Because Usopp is perfectly set up for that David role right down to the slingshot, although the only way I can currently imagine it happening is if there's some sort of cultural dispute happening on Elbaf right now. Because for Usopp to stand up to a giant, then that giant would need to insult Usopp's values, which at the moment happen to be tied to the values of the Elbaf warriors. Which is why we're all currently looking in the general direction of Loki, because we have yet to explore the giant royalty at all. All we know about are the warrior class citizens on Elbaf, but there is assumedly an entire monarchy sitting up there on their big old tree, and they might not necessarily have the same values as the warriors down below. As time has gone on, they may have lost their way and leaned more towards the world noble end of the spectrum, likely with some nasty interference of course, because Kingdom arcs in One Piece almost never involved the rightful royals being the bad guys. Although the one example I can think of where this isn't the case was Drum Island with Wapol, he was definitely the bad guy. But in every other kingdom situation, think Alabasta, Fishman Island, Dressrosa, Wano, it's always a force outside that has infiltrated to twist people against the current rulers. The gag with Vegapunk going "what" over and over was hysterical. So I think that one panel of Vegapunk reacting to all of the news perfectly encapsulated the weekly reading experience of Egghead Island. Because from the audience perspective, it's like, what? Vegapunk's on the island? What? El Rablucci's here? Oh mate, now Kizaru's here? What is happening? And Elder Star is here? Now 5 old men are here and we're fighting against them with 2 sun gods and a robot? It's been non-stop madness, and Elbaf has a lot of work to do to even reach this level, let alone do better than that level. That's the word I'm looking for. Top it? Yeah. My favorite part of the chapter was the line where Shaka says, "What constitutes death for someone like us?" So this line was said whilst Vegapunk, Shaka, and Pythagoras were standing in front of Punk Records, which is very intentional because that big old brain contains the memories of all 7 Vegapunks. And what's that famous line about memories in One Piece? When does a man die? When he is forgotten. So in this case, not only are these 3 people, not dead because other people remember that they were alive, but actually because their memories do live on in another vessel, the big head, but also Lilith. And I guess also York. Lilith, York, and the head have the shared experience of all 3 of them. And this also juxtaposes very strongly against Kuma's situation where his body lived on, but his memories were removed. And the whole discussion about how losing one's memories is effectively killing the person who was formed by those memories, even if the technical definition of life is still active. And now Kuma has much the same bittersweet advantage that the Vegapunks do, because Bonnie now has all of his memories, and so his entire being now lives on within her, and in a much more powerful way than your standard remembrance. What's also interesting is the device the Vegapunks used to wipe their memories was different to the one that was used on Kuma. So I wonder if the Kuma memory wiping device was an older model that got refined over the years, or, and I wouldn't rule this out, if Vegapunk just has multiple memory wiping devices just lying around all of his labs. I should add that One Piece also has that very enduring theme of using the end as a beginning. Take Logtown for example, the town of beginnings and endings, which is where our story began with Roger's execution, which was his end, but the beginning of our great age of piracy. And almost every time we reach one of these endings, it results in a new beginning. Whitebeard dying during the Paramount War was signaling the end of his era as well as the end of our pre-time skip, but the beginning of a new era and our post-time skip. And it's especially true with Vegapunk because his end signifies the beginning of our end. This is the final push to the One Piece. Internet stranger, we must congratulate Nico Robin on becoming the 3-time world champion of surviving a Buster Call. That's very true. This whole time I have been preemptively calling her the world record holder for amount of Buster Calls. However, it's only now that she's officially earned that title after having survived her 3rd Buster Call. But also, Robin aside, something very special has happened on Egghead, because it may very well be the first island to survive a Buster Call, because there's a lot of destruction, but a whole ton of the island is still intact, and the Buster Call itself was defeated. It was stopped. So we're entering an era where the pressing of the golden snail is no longer a guaranteed signal of doom, but unfortunately the world government now have a much more better weapon to fill that gap. So we are leaving Egghead with the Mother Flame and Punk Records in the world government's hands. Can't say this is the end of the arc. Too many things are unattended. There could be another chapter or 2 of wrap up, but this is feeling pretty final to me. And I do think that yes, we're leaving Punk Vegapunk records and the Mother Flame with the world government, which is bad, but what else can we do? However, our saving grace is what Vegapunk said in this chapter, that the Mother Flame still has yet to be perfected, and until York can manage to do that, if she can manage to do that, not all is lost. Are we not gonna mention how S-Snake and probably the rest of the Seraphim stayed on the island and were not affected by the Haki? So S-Snake was unaffected, which is curious. I mean, firstly, I think the answer is bubbles. There's always bubbles. If the bubble tech is powerful enough to contain a Seraphim, then I would bet, a frankly uncomfortable quantity of cash monies, that they're also powerful enough to insulate the Seraphim from a burst of even the most potent of Conqueror's Haki. Alternatively, remember that Dory said that this Haki didn't seem hostile. It was pretty chill to them. It was much less chill to all the Marines, but it seems that this ancient Haki can distinguish allies from enemies. So maybe the burst of Haki just considered S-Snake an ally. Because other than killing Pythagoras, she has been a pretty solid ally, even under York's command because of her thing for Luffy. Internet man, who do you think is the MVP of this arc? That's a tough question. I mean, it's gotta be Luffy, right? There was a point where this rubber dude was holding off both Kizaru and Saint Saturn all on his own, and everything we accomplished here was only possible because he is such a beast. But then again, you could also make the argument for Vegapunk being the MVP because his plan had the biggest overall effect. And if we're counting flashbacks, I do think there's a strong case for Kuma as well. He's definitely the emotional MVP of the arc at the very least. I have a feeling that Lilith is going to join Neomans. Ooh, alright. If she and Stussy were to join Neomans, then it would really become worthy of its name, because we now have two incarnations of two of the original members. And to be honest, it's not hard to see Lilith getting along with Caesar and Judge, particularly Caesar, who she can definitely bond with over the struggle for research funds. Also thinking about it, the whole idea of Vegapunk being in a group like this to begin with is, I think, a solid demonstration of the bit of evil that did exist within him, because he was facilitating all of these questionable minds. So I do think that Lilith would feel quite at home. And when it comes down to it, it may actually fall to Neomans to make Vegapunk's dream come true, which is difficult to conceive of at the moment because Caesar and Judge are such despicable beings. But if we can get the gang back together, then this is a group that could even surpass Vegapunk and his satellites. Is Egghead the only post-time skip arc without a feast? Not the only one, but it's one of the very rare ones. Whole Cake Island also ended without a feast because the crew were in a very similar situation where they had to retreat ASAP. Although I guess, depending on your perspective, it did end with a feast, at least for Big Mom, who got to nom nom on some colossal cakey. Also, I think that Egghead is ending with a feast, because the Giants do have that onboard chef who was told to prepare an ungodly quantity of food. So I think that the feast may actually be taking place right now on the way to Elbaf. In the French translation, it's clearly said that Joy Boy's Haki is superior to Shanks's. Not maybe. Well, tant mieux pour les Français. Obviously, Joy Boy's Haki is stronger. I don't think that was ever in question, but I still maintain that Dory using Shanks as the next nearest comparison is still hype as crap. Found that this chapter was a disappointment. Already thought we were going to Elbaf, and it's just a mini recap of the previous chapters. Alright, so I can sort of understand this feeling, because this sort of chapter isn't what One Piece is best at, which is usually a bombardment of new information and questions with each installment. However, there comes a time where eventually those questions have to be answered, and this is that time. We're at the end of the arc. I do want to stress that this chapter isn't a recap though, it's more of a wrap-up that fills important gaps. And if we didn't have this chapter, then there would be a whole ton of people complaining that Oda never answered how or why, or maybe even some other question words, about Vegapunk making this message in the first place, and why did Shaka know that he was going to die, and all the stuff like that. There's a lot of little things like that that would be incomplete and unsatisfying without this chapter. But I also think it provides something new and very important, which is that we now know that Vegapunk is the one who actively made the choice to die. It gives him a lot of power and agency, as opposed to this being a tragic event that not even the smartest person in the world could find a way out of. In fact, it completely flips that script because, as it turns out, the world government played perfectly into the hands of the world's smartest man, and thus making him worthy of that title to the very end. They couldn't overcome him because of their inferior brain matter. And as I talked about in the last video, I do think that we're going to appreciate this 2-week void a lot more in retrospect. Once we know the truth of the Void Century, I think that we're going to look back at these 2 weeks of events and see a lot of similarities and a lot of hints that Oda left for us in this moment. We still don't know who helped Luffy to teleport. Yeah, it's true. We still don't know both who teleported him and who gave him the food, assuming they're the same person. Which would kind of annoy me if this was indeed the end of the arc, because that is too big and too random of an event to leave unanswered. My prediction would be that this question, like many in this chapter, gets wrapped up by a short flashback around now. Say, for example, if the Kizaru Uber Eats theory turned out to be true, then we see him sailing away from Egghead and briefly briefly reflecting on that one glint of good he provided. I'm gonna say this in advance though, we need this answered in the actual series. I say we, I guess I don't speak for you. I need this answered in the actual series. If Oda answers this question in an SBS or something, then I think that would just be very lazy writing. But we're not at that point of accusation quite yet. And look, if you subscribe to Noodle Theory, there is a potential hint as to who could have fed Luffy, as one of the main sources of Kizaru speculation is that we saw Mr. Sparkle Admiral eating a bowl of ramen right before the assault on Egghead, and that exact same style of bowl appears near Luffy when he's suddenly eating all the food. It might mean nothing. This might just be how Oda draws any standard ramen bowl in One Piece, but no matter what, I can say for a fact that it is indeed a thing. Don't let Sangi under a lady giant. I'll do my best. I just realized Dory mentioned in Little Garden that there was another man who left without setting the log pose. I think that might be Roger's crew, and that's how they know Shanks. So this is a lesser known One Piece misconception. The whole problem with landing on Little Garden is that it took the log pose a year to reset for travelers to get onwards to the next island. And in the anime, Dory suggested that the Straw Hats could just set sail without paying any attention to the log pose and see where they ended up, adding that a certain someone they'd met long ago did exactly that. The implication being, well, actually, I don't know what the anime were thinking at the time. There was so little context available, but I guess in retrospect, the implication is that it was Roger or Shanks. But it doesn't really matter because this line was anime only. In the manga, Dory never mentions this person. Although I guess what we have here is a very unusual situation of filler content going on to become canon. I mean, it wasn't filler. It was just a strange one-liner they threw in there. But we do know that Shanks must have been on Little Garden at some point to have met Dory and Broggy, so it would be a pretty ballsy Shanks maneuver to not wait on Little Garden for a whole year before moving on and just YOLOing his way back into the Grand Line. But I can see it happening. Why did Vegapunk wait after knowing about York's betrayal? Why not tell the world immediately if he knows he is doomed? So that, I think, is a pretty fair question, but I have an even more bigger question. And I've brought this up a lot, but when we first met Stella, he was phasing into Emmett, which which I assumed was the moment that he was placing the Den Mushi. However, by this point, we know that he'd had his memories erased and he didn't even know his own plan, so he probably wasn't doing that. And in the Void flashback, we see the three Vegapunks talking about how no one will suspect where the hidden Den Mushi is, so I guess this is when it was placed? In which case, just what was Stella doing when we first met him phasing into Emmett? Like checking out of curiosity or what? I'm not going to like Elbaf unless Oda puts in Vicky the Viking references, because him liking the show as well is the only reason I got into One Piece. So this comment is a bit of a deep cut. It's referencing the fact that one of Oda's primary inspirations behind One Piece was Vicky the Viking, which was a cartoon created in collaboration between Germany and Japan, and it really popped off in Japan in particular. And there is already a Vicky the Viking reference in One Piece. The child who we saw on Elbaf is modeled directly after the titular Vicky, so with that in mind, I would be expecting many more references as we go on to explore Elbaf. Just a reminder, Saint Saturn is still on the island as we speak. What will he do? His absence in this chapter was definitely felt. The last time we saw him, he was standing surprisingly comfortably in front of the crumbling Emmett, and as he, and it stands, Saturn might be the only conscious person remaining on the side of the world government, which potentially puts Saturn in quite a bit of peril. Because he's now on the island, effectively on his own because everyone else is off having a lovely nap, which presents us with a very convenient situation to quietly take him out of the picture so that he can be impersonated later on. Personally, I really want to find a way to remove him at this point, because I can't shake the feeling that if we keep him in the story, he's just going to become another Jack. A villain whose narrative purpose was perfectly served and explored, and now we're just keeping him around so that he can eventually lose a fight later on. And the fact that all the Marines, and I mean all the Marines, now unconscious, does also give Stussy a good opportunity to escape. I imagine she wasn't targeted by this surprisingly discriminatory Haki since she's an ally, and it might be interesting to see if the Haki targeted Kaku and Roblucci as well. What does the mighty Joy Boy consider the two of them? Because right now, I think they kind of sit in the middle. Roblucci maybe a little less than middle. Kaku maybe a little more than middle. I'm surprised Kuma is still with the Straw Hats and somewhat intact. A few chapters ago, we all thought he would make a big sacrifice for Bonnie. Well, we were right about a big robot guy making a sacrifice so that everyone can escape. We were just wrong about which big robot guy it would be. And I am glad that Kuma is still, well, intact might be generous wording, but mostly not destroyed, and that Bonnie is getting to have this moment of peaceful reunion with him. While everyone else is celebrating, she's just adorably huddling up in the corpse, of her father, and it's all just very depressingly sweet. And it is one reason why I do think that Egghead might still have just a little bit of kick to it, because a large part of this arc has been Kuma's story, and I do think that needs a solid full stop. Which means that the pain of Bartholomew Kuma may not have ended for us just yet, because I could see a Going Merry style Viking funeral for Kuma, just to get all of those tears out one last time so that we're able to fully move on to our next adventure.